Good morning. This is Steven Haylestrom. Program is Let's Talk Housing, and this is on 92.7 FM in Peterborough, brought to you by Trent Radio, community radio, at its best, I might say, and thanks to them again for hosting this program, putting it out there. As well, this program is available as a podcast. You can find it on basically all your podcast apps, and it's Let's Talk Housing with Steven Haylestrom. Today, we're going to talk a lot about, actually what I'm going to bring you is I'm going to bring you some excerpts. I attended a housing forum put on by the Affordable Housing Committee of Northumberland County, which is a county, for those of you who aren't in Ontario or Canada or near the Greater Toronto area. Northumberland County is a county kind of just outside the Greater Toronto area. It is Peterborough County is where the city of Peterborough is in. Northumberland County is right beside Peterborough County, and Northumberland suffers with, and is very much involved in housing problems, the same as Peterborough County. So, in my endeavor to seek out information, etc., about housing in this general area, I attended the housing forum that was put on by the Affordable Housing Committee in November 2023, and I'm going to bring you some excerpts, part 1 and part 2. So part 1 is really going to be a history of the housing policy in Ontario. It's a fabulous discussion, and it may need to be, because of the length of it, I may bring you part 1 this week and part 2 next week. This is put on by Dr. Patricia Streech, and she is just fantastic. She has done a really thorough job of looking at a high-level overview of how the Canadian and Ontario governments have shaped housing policy since 1940. It's really good. So please give a listen and enjoy. Your comments, as usual, would really be appreciated. Thank you. Also, please excuse all of the echo and kind of distance. This was recorded during an event, so it's a little bit distracting. I apologize ahead of time for this, but give a listen. It really is valuable information. Thank you.
As I say, I am currently chair of the Social Planning Council in Kingston District, which I've been doing that for the past 5 years, and our main emphasis in all that time has been on housing. We've done a lot of things on housing. The history goes back to some time in the 1940s, and before we had a National Housing Act, we had a Dominion Housing Act. That's what it was called in the 1930s. And in 1944, we actually had the first National Housing Act. The National Housing Act was at that point primarily concerned about facilitating the ways that people could buy homes. Buying homes and being owners has always been important. Originally, the government actually lent money as mortgages to home buyers at very, very favorable interest rates. Later on, the government came out with mortgage insurance, so you could get a loan from the bank to buy a home. And we've always had a tax break for home buyers like myself when we're buying and selling houses. The veterans coming back from World War II was a big step in our housing policy. They were trying to help thousands of returning veterans to build small homes and start their families. Many of these are still here today, and in fact, I live in one of these houses. It was built by a veteran. They're very small, they're very very compact. We have 900 square feet of living space, and we managed to live in this, and people used to live in them with 3 children. So we know that it works, and actually we really like our small homes here. Okay, so as I said, in Canada, like the United States, the home buying has always been sort of an aspiration. Many Canadians bought their first homes with an actual CMHC mortgage. And Canada Mortgage Housing was originally called Central Mortgage. And people used to talk about Central Mortgage because it was money the government was actually giving to people as a mortgage. Of course, they had to pay it back. Later on, you could get an insured mortgage that was with CMHC, and the government of Canada is guaranteeing that if the borrower defaulted, the government would pick up the loss, the banks would get their money back, and in return for that, you could buy a home with a really low down payment, and usually with a lower interest rate. So you may have had a mortgage that was insured, and you were able to buy a home that way. For myself and everyone else, if we have bought and sold several homes over the years, we did not pay capital gains tax on any money that we made from selling a house that we had lived in. This is a large tax saving for most people. It's actually bigger than most of the housing subsidies we've had. Because I've had, I think, 4 houses since I started buying houses a long time ago, and they were sold. I don't remember if I made any money, but I know that I wasn't paying any tax on money I made from those houses, and that was important because it gave people a chance to build up a bit of money to buy the next house, and so then you'd be able to get a bigger house if you wanted to. At the moment, about 2 out of 3, 66% of Canadians live in a home they own. And that we've had higher rates than that sometimes. It's been closer to 70%. This is a high rate of home ownership in this country, and we have to keep that in mind when we say we have housing policies. Yes, we do, and we have some things that support opportunities for people to buy a home. At the same time, on the rental side, people have lots of housing problems. The National Housing Acts, which are the federal government acts, have been amended many times since 1944. There were big changes in 1954, and that was during the period when public housing was the vehicle that they used. That's how things were being dealt with at that time. So from the 40s right through to the 60s, the governments were funding a lot of low-income public housing and also these large urban renewal projects. That shifted over in the 70s and 80s when they introduced a non-profit cooperative housing program. And again, there was a big change around the year 2000 when they changed it again, and then that was called affordable housing. And now we have our new national housing strategy that was brought in 2017. It's hard for most people to remember what living conditions were like back in the 1940s and 50s. At that point in time, there was a tremendous backlog of really poor quality, substandard housing, a lot that didn't even have bathrooms or running water, and families were larger. So 30% of all the rental housing we had was substandard, and some of it was really, really bad. In the large cities, they had huge backlogs of what they used to call at that time. They were called slums because that's what was the word that was being used. The city of Toronto initially, went to the federal government and said, we've got to do something about the deplorable living conditions in the inner city. And that resulted in the start of urban renewal, where they basically took down the old stuff. They built large public housing projects, and the rents in those were supposed to be something that a normal working family could afford with a quarter of their incomes. That's the concept at the time. So everybody that would move into public housing would be lowering the subsidized. We call this regular to income housing now. And the largest project that was ever done was in Toronto at Regent Park. If you've been to Toronto, you might remember that Regent Park, before it got redeveloped in the last few years, but that was a huge redevelopment when they had to tear it down again and rebuild. Towards the end of the 1960s, there was a lot of community pushback, I guess, about urban renewal. Urban renewal had been ruthless, and it would go in and it would basically bulldoze and flatten a whole neighborhood and then start to build something new. And people were resisting that, and they called for the end of urban renewal. Now, I know we didn't have big downtown urban renewal in Kingston, and you probably don't have it in your communities, but that in the cities, that was a big switch over when they stopped doing urban renewal, because that's how they got the land to build the next generation of units. So by the end of the 60s, we had about 250,000 units of public housing, and a lot of that is still there. And if you know how that works, if you meet the criteria, you apply for public housing, and you go on a wait list. And because there's not much turnover, those waiting times can be very long. In Kingston, for example, we have about 1,000 units of public housing, which is fully RGI housing, and there's a wait list of over 1,200 families, who are waiting for those. And some of them can wait 7 years or more. Having a wait list is fine, but it can take a very long time. So people said we don't want any more of this big, high-density, low-income housing, and there was a complete rewrite of the National Housing Act. And that was all based around the idea of small-scale projects, community-based, mixed income, not owned by the big government housing authorities. And so we started to see a lot of non-profit groups coming together and people that wanted to develop cooperative housing. And the large majority of all that was small projects. Some were quite small. Some had, 40 or 50 rental units. They weren't the massive, thousands and thousands of units. So it was a much more community-based approach. All the levels of government were subsidizing these programs. We had very good subsidies that would help to keep the rents down so you could get a mix of lower income and moderate income people. The non-profits are still there, and the co-ops are still there today. It's still more affordable than what the private rental market can provide. It was a very, very successful model. A lot of good groups that were involved with the non-profits in particular were churches. Many different types of churches would say, we want to build something to help our community, and they became a housing non-profit. Those projects are still there. Others were groups like Kiwanis or Kinman, all kinds of charitable groups, community groups, all they had to do, I say all they had to do, we know how hard it is, but they had to create a little nonprofit, and then they could build a small-scale mixed housing. They could house a lot of different kinds of people, like seniors and people with disabilities, and families, and it had a completely different image from high-density public housing. In Kingston, we have 24 nonprofits and co-ops that are still going strong and still providing housing. So just to bring this down to a small scale here. This was a report that we've had 2 other students in 2021, and they contacted all of the nonprofits and co-ops in Kingston and put together a story about what that group did, about the housing they provided, and anyone that's interested can see a copy of this on our Social Planning Council website. It was a beautiful report. They were all very proud of what they have and what they've been able to achieve, and still keeping the rents affordable with the mix of incomes, because they do have a mix with some lower income people and some middle income people. So please, if you're interested, take a look at that, because it's they put a lot of love into making that into something that's very, very informative, as well as it's nice to have pictures. So that's what nonprofits and co-ops did, and you'll know if you drive by something, it'll have a sign, it will say, well, some of them have signs, with the name of the group that owns the building as a non-profit or a co-op and runs the building for the people who live there. By 1995, there was a whole big change in how Canada was dealing with housing. The provinces had been pushing to take control of housing because they felt that it wasn't a federal responsibility. They wanted to do their own housing policy, and the upshot of all of that was that they divested a lot of the responsibility down to a provincial level. It was a time of economic fiscal restraint in the federal budget, and basically they put an end to all the social housing programs. The federal government of the day stopped funding more social housing at that point, and they signed agreements with most of the provinces to hand over all that responsibility to the province. Once all that took about 6 years for them to negotiate all of that. When that was done, Ontario, the province of Ontario, passed what it called the Social Housing Reform Act, and eventually they downloaded all of the housing responsibility to the municipal governments. So are you beginning to see a pattern here where people are like handing over responsibility to somebody else, and then they hand over the responsibility to someone else? That's what's been going on. Unfortunately, through that process, there was no new funding to build more social housing. Although the existing non-profits are still there, we couldn't add more of it. Okay, so then sometime in the early 2000s, they introduced this new thing that was called affordable market rents. The federal government went back to supporting the private market. There was some very limited grants to help reduce the rents, so it would be slightly under the average market rent. And these were rents that were too high for people on waiting lists for the social housing, but they were producing affordable housing. In around 2000, there was increasing concern about homelessness. This is when people were seeing suddenly large increases in homeless people, especially in the large cities. the city said, we can't deal with this, and then of course they went back to the federal government and said, this is a national crisis. They called it a national crisis. That meant the federal government should do something about it. And so it was in 2001, I think, we had the first National Homelessness Initiative. That's how long people have been trying to deal with homelessness in the large cities. All of that continued, and they continued to deliver these things they called affordable market rents, which was something like 80% of the market rent was supposed to be affordable. By around 2016, the city said, we have a crisis, something has to be done about housing, and they, of course, went to Ottawa and said, you have to do something. And so the upshot of that was, we have a new national housing strategy that was released in 2017. That was a really landmark event because it meant that the federal government is getting back into housing again. Having been forced out in the 1990s, all of a sudden in 2017, they're back involved again. They did a lot of consultation, they asked Canadians what they wanted. It was a process where they really tried to find out what the views of Canadians were. And the report came out with a remarkable claim that every Canadian has a right to housing they can afford. This is a human rights framework that's never been mentioned before as part of government's policies. It was a significant change. The federal government said there's going to be, originally it was $40 billion over 10 years. That increased to over $50 billion in 10 years that would be dedicated to this, to transformation, to try to create new housing that was affordable. There was an awfully long list of government policies and programs that people could apply for. They set a lot of targets and numbers. There was some of this funding was to go to private rental supply, and sadly there wasn't any new real money that was being put into mixed income, community-based rental that people can afford. So as of today, 2023, we're at about the midpoint in this 10-year plan. Okay, so in terms of what we can say about the situation today, and I'm talking generally, and I can talk about Kingston, but in your own communities what your situations are. Overall, across the country, about a third of the people that rent can't afford what they have to pay for a place to live. That's 1 out of 3. These are families, they're seniors, they're single people, everybody, they don't have affordable housing. It's more than 1 million households. We know that rents have been growing really fast and much faster than people's incomes. And the result of that is that people have been losing their homes. Even if they had a rental place, they couldn't afford the rent. They would have to move. Moving is problematic because some places have no vacancies. Kingston has had a very low vacancy rate. It's now about 1% of units that are available to rent, let alone what the price is. There's just no places. You go and look for a small place. There is very, very few that are available. We have not been building any new buildings that have average or affordable rents. And this is now affecting everybody. It's families with children, it's seniors, it's single people. And these folks are losing their homes. And then, of course, we have people who have no homes at all. The numbers of homeless people have skyrocketed. There's at least 250,000 homeless people across the country. It's not a small problem. Even in Kingston, we've been trying to deal with the rising numbers of homeless people. That being said, we still have a lot of public housing. We have a lot of social housing. It is affordable, but it's full. And it means that there are long waiting lists for people who maybe, have to move tomorrow. You're not going to be able to get into social housing generally in a few days. There's tons of lessons learned that we could learn from the past. I'm a very positive person. I know we can do this, and I know we have a good model of how we can do this. So it's not like this is a problem that we can't solve. But just setting goals and announcing money doesn't actually make the housing affordable. You've got to have some way of subsidizing is the wrong word, because you're investing actually in some good social assets in your community. You're creating affordable rents that can be there for decades. When you develop a private property or a rental property, it's going to be there for decades. So you have to think of it as an investment in the community. The rents that are rising affecting people's incomes is one thing that we hear about. We haven't heard quite so much about how this is hitting retired people on low pensions. They may have worked all their lives and have a small pension, and they will have other pension income, like the OAS and GIS, and that's great. Excuse me, but they're not, those pensions, some of them are indexed to the cost of living and some aren't, but they're very, very small, and they're not increasing at 5% a year or 10% a year. So for a retired person on a pension, they're not going to be able to handle a rent increase that's going to be 10%. They just don't have the money. We haven't been hearing as much as we should about that particular problem. The other problem we're having at the moment is that people are being forced to move. And if they do that, it means a large increase in rent, because the rent controls we have in Ontario are not really rent controls. Yes, they do limit the rent increase if you stay where you are. If you're a tenant and you just don't move, there's a limit on how much your rent can go up. So we do have regulations about that. But if someone moves out and the landlord can then advertise that unit, they can increase the rent as much as they want. There is no limit on that. And generally speaking, they want to increase rents because their costs of everything are going up. They've got rising costs for all the utilities and repairs and taxes. So obviously they're going to want to charge a higher rent. So a new tenant moving in is going to pay a much higher rent. In a place like Kingston, we have a huge student population. You probably realize that Queen's University itself has 25,000 students. We also have RMC, Royal Military College, which is a teaching campus, and we also have a community, St. Lawrence, which is another post-secondary institution. All of that together, you've got 30,000 people who are coming here to go to school. They face horrendous rents when they come here, and sometimes they have to live in very overcrowded conditions. The problem is that there's so many of them that is taking up a lot of the housing stock that we have in Kingston. And it's not just in Kingston. The small places have that problem as well. Whoops. I don't know what I just did here, people.
like increasing rents. Just explode on it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a minute. I have no idea what it did. I will try and get back into this and see if it's still going to work for me. That was exciting. Anyway, as I said, we are places like Guelph. I'm thinking of some of the other smaller communities. They also have a lot of students, and they have some private landlords that specialize in students and like to work with students. But there's also some on-campus housing. But that's usually just for a small group of students. Usually the first year students that come into Kingston, they can live in residence. After that, they have to move out. The impact of the students is a big problem. You don't have any. I don't think you have any large post-secondary institutions, but they do tend to drive the rents up faster, if I can put it that way. We've been having lots of problems with homelessness, and as you say, and lots of people who are losing their homes. We sponsored a special study over the last year. We just completed it. We released a report in November, which was called Tenant Displacement. It's not just about eviction, where people get an eviction notice. It's when people are basically forced out of their housing. And we're actually having a webinar on Friday this week to present the results of some of that back to the community. What the project involved was actually talking to people that had lived through that experience, and that means that they had a place to live. They were managing, they could afford it, but then something happened, and they were forced to move. And once that happened, they found out that there was very little other available rental places that they could afford. But they had previously been able to find something where they were paying their rents, they were managing, and suddenly there was a change in who owned the building, or it may have been that the landlord was trying to do a lot of renovations, and so the people needed to move out. That there's various scenarios that people described to us. And it was interesting and very troubling that some of these were people that had children, and they were now trying to find some place to live with children. There were people that had disabilities that needed some kind of something done to their bathrooms or something to make it possible for them to stay in the rental unit. It was people, seniors that were on low pensions, who had somehow, been caught up in the middle of all this. Everybody who had a place to live before was suddenly faced with the prospect of it. We don't even think, you wouldn't think of these are not your stereotypical homeless people. These are people, and some of them are working and or have some kind of income. It's not that they don't have to do that, but there's just no place to live. So we put this collection of stories together, and we issued our report in November. It makes for interesting reading to look at the stories, because the stories are very moving. and show how many different situations can cause a person to lose a home. So that's what we're trying to talk about. That report is also on our website. I've got the link to all that, and I'm sure Don will circulate this. Please do feel free to look at any of the material we have and contact us if there's something else that you might be interested in. Our role at the Social Planning Council is to work with the community, and we're all volunteers. Occasionally we have some grants where we can hire students, things like that. But we are all committed to improving the conditions for everybody in our community. And I think it's helpful if you can see how other communities are going about this. I know our situation is very different. Kingston, Frontenac is different from other places too. But you sometimes you can have a helpful suggestion that had been tried somewhere else, and then think, okay, we can that would help us. Let's see whether we can do something like that. So that was what I was going to say. I know that's covered in a lot of history, but the history is important because you know now that we already have been providing affordable housing for decades. We know how to do it. It's not a mystery. And yeah, we have a problem. We haven't got enough housing that's affordable for people. So I'm going to stop there and hope that Don is going to put some questions.
Take the questions there, Patricia, for you.
Okay, so the question I see says, you mentioned the impact of protest against urban renewal. How does this compare to today's NIMBY challenges? Okay, that's an interesting question. I would say that they're completely different because urban renewal was, in Canada and the US, well, the US is a bit different, I'll take that back. Urban renewal involved bulldozing a lot of really terrible housing in the inner cities. Generally, there weren't any high-income people living in the downtown Toronto area because they had nice homes on the outskirts of town. So you weren't getting pushback from middle-income people about urban renewal. You were getting pushback from people who saw those as their communities and their homes, because that was where their families lived and they worked. Often, they walked to work, they worked in factories, they worked in, they were neighborhoods, and so it was the low-income people themselves that were involved in a lot of these protests, that they didn't want to just see their communities bulldozed. Today with NIMBY, what we usually see is that it's a conflict between people with different incomes, because it's the middle-income people that want to protect the neighborhoods. They don't want more diversity of people moving into their neighborhoods. So it's a different struggle for what we have today. A lot of places have been able to combat NIMBY by doing more community-based planning, when you need community-trained people to go and work with the community, so you can find ways for them to move together, so you can have the middle-income people involved in the planning and the with the lower-income people, so that it's not being forced into the community. It's got to be planning that comes from a community as a whole. And there have been some really successful examples of that. But yeah, having just plopping down some new project in a neighborhood, that never goes well. I think you can guarantee that won't go well. So that's the federal. I was going to say in the U.S., of course, their cities were high concentrations of colored people, people who were immigrants from other countries. So the inner cities in the U.S. were even larger problems than the cities we had here. And, they're still dealing with that kind of, that's an extra layer of issues that they deal with in their planning. I think somebody's putting more questions into the box.
Yeah, so
I'm watching the box.
Yeah, you watch the box. So the next question comes in. It says we have a lot of statistics about housing and housing wait lists and statistics of people who are waiting for that. And just wondering if there's statistics that are provided at the federal level or provincial level that talk about individuals experiencing homelessness.
Okay, interesting question. There are some statistics. With the money that has been spent under National Housing Strategy, some of that money has been put into new surveys about social housing, and the surveys were done by Statistics Canada, which is the one that does all the data collection for the census and the labour force survey. So. Yeah, there is some data, and you can Google it. Ask Google. I can send you the actual titles of all this stuff. There are some numbers. The coverage of that across the country is not consistent. I say there are some problems with this statistic, but they have been trying to collect some national statistics. We still rely a lot on the other big important statistic is what's going on with rents. And every year CMHC does the rent survey in cities. I'm not sure what kind of coverage you would have in Northumberland County, but like in Kingston or in Peterborough, we have data reports that CMHC puts out, and they're usually released in January, and it gives you the results of the rent surveys. The rent surveys are done in the fall, and the data comes out in January. So we're waiting right now for the update on what are our rents, what's our vacancy rate, so you can look at the trends and see what's happened over the last year. I mean, we obviously expect the rents to go up. Excuse me, and the vacancy rate can't get much lower. I mean, it's almost zero. But that data, we rely on that data to assess the situation of how bad the situation is for rental. And you can look into if there is any coverage for that area. I just don't know the answer to that question. But you need to look at the rent data, because that's going to give you the story about what the impacts are on your community. As long as those rents keep going up 5 or 10% a year, you're going to have more people being homeless. So, okay, that's statistics. Lots of numbers around. Be very careful what numbers you use. That would be my advice.
So we have another
federal or provincial.
Yeah. We have another question
So
that's come in, Patricia. Which one are you?
Yeah, I see. I've got a question in the chat about federal provincial stats for people experiencing homelessness. Excuse me, I have a terrible cold, and I'm glad I'm not there spreading my germs with you. Yes, there's lots of numbers on homelessness as well. And I love data as much as the next person, but really you have to be very careful what data you're using. You remember I told you that we had the first National Homelessness Initiative. It came out in 2001. That was federally funded, and over the years it grew and it grew, and people said we need more data on homelessness and what the numbers are. So out of the federal money, they started funding what they called point-in-time surveys. And these were the monies usually go to something like the United Way or some local organization, and they put people on, got surveyors. They get volunteers that will be willing to do this and go out on the street and find. They have to find the homeless people, and it's done on 1 or 2 nights during the winter time usually. So in the case of Kingston, the numbers are put together by the United Way. They get the funding to run this survey. Pretty much every year they do it. And we get numbers. The numbers tell us how many people they found on the streets who were homeless and didn't have a place to go. And you'll, if you look at some of the reports for the city of Toronto, Vancouver, big cities, like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are homeless on any given night. The numbers that we usually get from that are very small. So if I was to rely on this homelessness count for one night, on one night of the year, I would think we don't have a problem for homelessness in Kingston. So, yes, there's numbers, but yeah, be very careful what you're going to rely on for those numbers. The impact of foreign investors in the housing market. Okay, that's an interesting question. I would make that a bigger question. What's the impact of investors in the housing market? Because the problems that we have now are just not about foreign investors, but they're Canadian investment companies who are growing by leaps and bounds, and basically they're investing in rental because it's a very profitable form of investment. So you've probably heard about the REITs, the apartment REITs, and how they're buying up older rental and massively increasing the rents in those buildings. There are some studies on this. If I could send some references for you, if anyone's interested, or you can contact me directly. I've been doing some work on apartment REITs and the impact of those in Kingston, because some of these large firms have moved into the Kingston market. A couple of the large ones, and they've been buying up buildings like crazy. Sometimes they do improvements in the buildings, but always their goal is to increase rents very, very substantially, and that produces a higher return to the investors, which is why they're doing this at all. It's become difficult for some tenants to stay in these buildings, and there's some not very nice things that have been going on as they would try to make tenants move, because they need the tenants to move so that they can increase the rents. So the REIT impact, it has not reached its crescendo as yet. It's still climbing across the country. So I'll make a note of that. We did a webinar actually on. We had some people talk about REITs back in, I think that was the spring last year. I'll send some stuff to Dawn on this. I can send you a slide deck, actually. I put together a slide deck on that one as well. The investors will only stay in this if it's profitable. You know that. And it is highly profitable. Rental housing is highly profitable. Especially if you don't spend too much money on fixing it and you keep putting up the rents. And so as long as we have all these tax breaks in the tax system for people who invest in rental, those are big tax breaks. It's money that the government doesn't have as revenue. But the effect of all that is, to have a lot of speculative investment. That's my opinion on this. In my opinion, would I agree over decades there's been a change in society regarding the common good and one's responsibility to be involved in creating a society that focuses on, it's a long question. So going back. Changes in Canadian society regarding the common good. I'm not sure that that's happening. I'm not sure how we would know if that was happening. There seems to be more emphasis now on individualism, but at the same time, I still see a lot of very committed and dedicated volunteers and people working in the voluntary sector, people who, are concerned about the conditions for everybody. This social justice side of things is still very, very strong, and it's still strong in Kingston. I'm not sure in Northumberland, but without the way that the community responded, during the pandemic when we were having this horrible growth in homeless people were living outside, there's still a huge number of people who are committed to try and help those people and to change those conditions. So for me, I don't know how I would weigh that up. I think that we want everybody to have opportunities. And we come at that from the social justice point of view. The Social Planning Council in Kingston, most social planning councils, concerned about the quality of life for everybody in the community. Okay. You guys have lots of interesting questions. Without 3 levels of government, yes. The question is about the governments fighting with each other. There's a long history of the conflicts between the federal government, the provincial governments, the municipalities. Has it ever resulted in anything positive? I'm not sure about that. I mean, all I see when I look at the pattern of the history myself, having been in the thick of some of that, when the federal government stepped out of housing in the 1990s, it was very much, let's see what they like it. They've been lobbying for a long time. The provinces keep lobbying. They want to be in charge. They want to be in control. It's their jurisdiction, and they had some constitutional grounds for that, that housing wasn't a federal responsibility in our constitution. So they had something on their side. And it was some of the provinces that were leading the charge on that. In particular, at that time, it was Alberta and Quebec that were very, very committed. They wanted to take over and get the federal government out of housing. And the other provinces, some were neutral on it. They didn't care. Some said, no, we want the federal government to stay. So they didn't all agree. So it's some of the provinces that tend to lead the charge, so to speak. And then there was the issue about the division of responsibilities between the province and the municipality. Generally speaking, the provinces, including our province, they don't like the federal government dealing with the cities directly, because, as they point out, the municipalities are under provincial jurisdiction. Right? However, every time there's a big problem, like homelessness, the province sort of washes its hands of it and say, well, that's a big responsibility. The federal government should do something about it. So the cities end up going to Ottawa to lobby on the federal government because the province has told them to get lost. And so once again, you start to get this relationship between the federal government and the municipalities, and that's what's going on right now. I'm sure you saw an announcement last week where Chris Jeffrey was announcing special money for the city of Toronto to create more affordable housing in the city. Now, yesterday we had the statements on the fiscal situation and, and a commitment for, another $10 billion into housing. There's a constant discussions about, how much money everybody's going to get, because the federal government will give certain amounts to certain provinces, and sometimes there's strings attached to that they may not like. And sometimes the money goes directly to the cities, which provinces hate it when they do that. It's fascinating. For me anyway, I was born in Britain, so we only had one government, so it was easy to decide who we were going to criticize. We always blamed the government in London. But in this country, it's pretty hard to figure out who you're going to blame, You need to be a constitutional lawyer to figure out who to blame. If it's health, well, I could blame the province, but if it's, higher education, used to be more federal, but now a lot of that's gone to the province as well. And then at the city level, the city keeps saying, well, we don't have jurisdiction because that's a provincial jurisdiction, so, we can't blame the cities because they don't have the authority because it's determined provincially. I find all this very fascinating, but at the end of the day, the housing is going to get built in the communities. It's not going to get built, at a provincial or federal level. It's the community that you need to look at. So you figure out how can I get some help from the federal government, how can I get some help from the province, and then you could go to city council and you get some money from them. So that's how you have to work with those other levels. They do tend to like fighting amongst themselves, so that's very Canadian.
Hi, and that was Patricia Stretch. She's from Kingston, as you hear in the interview. She has been active for many years in the affordable housing world. Really, really informative, brilliant person. Next week, I'll bring you some more of her answers and questions and answers. It's really very interesting information for sure. And as well, I'll bring you more from that Northumberland Housing Forum. It really is, it was surprisingly good. And by the way, it was held at Victoria Hall in Port Hope, and the place was jammed. And it was really, really heartening to see all of the people who were participating and were interested, both from governments, from government agencies, from non-profits. The mayor of Port Hope was there. People from the Northumberland County government were there. A number of not-for-profits, part of the rest of the what I'll do next week is a person who is is with Habitat for Humanity. There is a wide variety of people. I was honestly surprised, blown away at how well the whole thing was put together, and I'm so glad to be able to present this to you and allow you to get a glimpse into what is happening. Still, we need more action, but at least there is real things happening. And one of the most important things was said was that often when especially affordable housing projects are done, you hear a lot from the people who don't like it. And you need to hear more from the people who like it. And I think we all need to get geared up to be able to be there, so to support these projects when they happen, rather than only hear from the people who are unsupportive. Thank you. Okay, this is Steven Haylestrom. This is Let's Talk Housing, and 92.7 FM, Peterborough, Ontario, Trent Radio. Thank you. We will talk to you all next week. Take care. Have a wonderful week.